Good morning, everyone. All information contained herein is provided solely for educational purposes. It is not intended as a substitute for professional or legal advice. Should you decide to act upon any information contained in this presentation, you do so at your own risk. While the information posted has been verified to the best of our abilities, we cannot guarantee that there are no mistakes or errors. This is the Enviroschool program at the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. Today, we are presenting Understanding LDEQ's Air Emissions Inventory and Other Air Emissions Data. We will be muting everyone except for the speaker. However, just as a precaution, go ahead and keep yourself muted individually as well. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A option and not the chat. Type in your questions and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Slides and a recording of this webinar will be available on the Enviroschool website and the LDEQ YouTube page. There will be a poll at the end of this webinar to provide your feedback so we can improve our sessions. So please complete before logging off. Email any comments, questions, or concerns to enviroschool@la.gov. Also, topics for 2022, if there are any you are interested in seeing. Our speaker today is Kelly Peterson. Kelly has been with LDEQ for 18 years. She worked in the Water Enforcement Division's Permit Compliance Unit as both an environmental scientist and supervisor for 10 years before moving to the Air Quality Planning and Assessment Division in the Office of Environmental Assessment. There, she is responsible for collecting and managing air emissions inventory data from facilities across the state. Kelly, you can go ahead and get started.
All right, thanks, Tamika. Today, we're here to talk about emissions inventory, and we'll go through other related EPA systems that rely on the emissions inventory data that we create and how they're used. So to start off, we're going to talk about what is an emissions inventory, and it is a listing of air pollutant emissions, the actual emissions from facilities and emitted into the atmosphere that are associated with a specific geographic area and time interval. And for Louisiana, obviously our emissions inventory covers the state of Louisiana, and the time period that we cover is a calendar year. So our emissions inventory includes the emissions from across the state and covers the calendar year from January 1st to December 31st. Why we need an emissions inventory. An emissions inventory, it's a key part of assessing the environmental air quality. If we don't know what's in the air, we have no idea how bad the air is. It also helps us demonstrate how much emissions and how much pollution from individual specific sources are contributing to the air quality in the local area and across the state. It helps us develop emissions control strategies when we identify specific industries or specific practices that are creating emissions that can be controlled. We can more accurately pinpoint and develop ways of controlling those emissions. It also helps us in choosing where we locate our ambient air quality monitoring sites and our monitoring equipment. So we're not placing monitoring stations in areas that already have great air quality, and we're not likely to find pollutants of concern. And when we repeat the emissions inventory periodically, which is for us is annual, it helps us see the effects of economic development and air quality programs on the air quality. It lets us know whether or not we're actually making a difference in improving air quality. And then lastly, one of the big parts of it is it provides our state information for the national emissions inventory. EPA maintains and develops an emissions inventory that covers the entire nation. It even includes emissions from international sources to the state of air quality in the United States. So that's why we create our emissions inventory. And the emissions inventory includes all sources of emissions. It includes emissions from point sources, which is what you would expect would be your industry, power plants, your big stationary sources of emissions. It also includes emissions from mobile sources, with like your cars, trucks, buses, motorcycles, your airplanes, your trains, even the ships that operate on the rivers. The mobile sources incorporate emissions from those as well. It also includes non-point or area emissions, and those are just emissions that come, they're from too many places or very small sources of emissions that are very hard to pinpoint. But it could come from your lawnmower at individual people's houses. There's all sorts of sources of emissions that go into the non-point category. And it also includes biogenic or natural emission sources. We do get emissions from the environment. Trees actually emit emissions. And I think our next slides are going to go through these in a little bit more detail. So our point sources are our large stationary sources. In 2020, our Louisiana point source inventory included 788 facilities. These are the facilities that we collected actual emissions data from to include in the Louisiana emissions inventory. And those sources come from all over the state. And this is a division of how many inventories we received by regional office within the state, the DEQ regional offices. And you'll notice that the Capital Regional Office has far more facilities that we collect data on than the other regions. And that's not because the Capital Region has that much more large industry. It's because we have pinpointed a problem that needed to be addressed as far as air quality in the Capital Region. And so we extended the number of facilities that we collect data on so that we could more accurately pinpoint and develop control strategies to address those. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about attainment and non-attainment and the national air quality, ambient air quality standards. So again, we'll get back to the non-point sources, and it does collectively represent all of the individual sources that are not inventoried as point or mobile sources. Examples of those are small oil and gas facilities. All of your dry cleaners have emissions, bakeries, painting facilities, car painting, regular house painting. Anything that creates emissions is included in the non-point category. And then your mobile sources, there are two categories of mobile sources. You've got on-road sources and you've got non-road sources. Your on-road sources are those that you would generally think of with your planes, trains, and automobiles. Your non-road vehicles are things that are not generally taken on the road, like your commercial marine vessels, your farm equipment, but your lawn and garden equipment, just anything that has an engine and is not on a road. And then your biogenic natural resources are emissions that are not caused or produced by humans, and trees and vegetation is one of those. Things like pine trees create terpenes, which is a volatile organic carbon source, and you can smell biogenic emissions, like when you go into a forest and there's like a smell in pine tree forests. Those are the terpenes that are coming from your pine trees. So the emissions inventory captures those emissions as well. And then when you look at the actual emissions inventory and you're looking at which pollutants we collect information on, there's two types of pollutants that we collect information on. We collect criteria pollutant, and those are established through EPA's National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And we'll go into more detail on those. And then there's toxic air pollutants. And Louisiana's regulations define those toxic air pollutants that we collect in our emissions inventory. And it is a list of toxic air pollutants. EPA also has a list of toxic air pollutants that they call the hazardous air pollutants. And Louisiana's list includes everything that's on EPA's hazardous air pollutant list with an additional 14 pollutants added. So the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and if you've listened to other environmental schools, they've probably talked about this as well. But EPA establishes these National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and the acronym is NAAQS, and we often refer to that as the NAAQS. So EPA establishes the NAAQS, and it sets a standard, and it sets a limit on the amount of pollutant that is acceptable to be in the ambient air. So when we have our monitoring stations set up, we monitor what the pollutant levels are. And if we exceed the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, it then triggers non-attainment with that standard. And we have to implement steps to ensure that we come into compliance with that standard. So an area that meets or does better than the National Ambient Air Quality Standards is called an attainment area. And if you're not in compliance with that standard, it's called a non-attainment area. And the Baton Rouge area being considered non-attainment for ozone is the reason that we have so many more facilities that are included in the emissions inventory for the capital area. Because for a while, for many years, we were out of attainment for ozone. And luckily, I think last year, we were designated as attainment for ozone in the Baton Rouge area. So we have evidence, and over years of emissions inventories, we can see that the emissions in the Baton Rouge area have come down, and we are now in attainment with that standard. And so the controls that we put in place have been effective. And that's one of the great things that you can see with the emissions inventory. And so now we are in technically what's called a maintenance period for ozone in the Baton Rouge area that will last 20 years, we'll maintain the controls and make sure that we maintain compliance and attainment with the ozone standard. So there are 6 criteria pollutants established by the NAAQS. And the NAAQS, there's one for carbon monoxide, one for lead, one for nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, ozone, and sulfur oxides. When that translates to the emissions inventory, we then have to look at which pollutants would create an excess of those criteria NAAQS pollutants. And so they're not one-to-one. It's not, ozone is not something that is just emitted from a facility. Generally, there are contributing pollutants that we use that react in the atmosphere and create ozone. So for each of these, I've kind of listed which parameters we measure in the emissions inventory as a result of the National Ambient Air Quality Standard. So for carbon monoxide, we can measure that one. Lead, nitrogen oxides. For particulate matter, we do collect 2 different types of pollutants for particulate matter. We collect PM10 and PM2.5. PM10 is for any particulate matters that are 10 micrometers and smaller, and 2.5 are for even smaller particulate matter. And to give you an idea, a strand of hair is around 70 micrometers. So we're talking really, really fine particulate matter. Another pollutant that we measure as an indicator for particulate matter is ammonia, because when ammonia is emitted into the atmosphere, it often reacts and is a contributor to particulate matter. For ozone, the 2 primary pollutants that we look at as being photoreactive and react in sunlight in the atmosphere to create ozone are nitrogen oxides and volatile organic carbons. So we collect NOx and VOC as an indicator for ozone. And then sulfur dioxide, we do measure as a direct precursor or parallel to sulfur oxides. To kind of give an idea of what each of these pollutants are, carbon monoxide is colorless and odorless, and it's generally produced by the incomplete combustion of carbon in fuels. Lead is historically emitted by motor vehicles, mostly in industrial sources. We've really reduced through unleaded gasoline, the lead coming from motor vehicles, but those are our primary sources of lead. NOx comes from burning of fuel, and it's both an important precursor for ozone and acid rain formation. PM, that's any dirt, dust, soot. There's even liquid droplets of particulate matter. Those are all captured in our PM parameters. VOC, it's not directly regulated through the NACs, but it is an important precursor to ground level ozone formation. And the same thing with ammonia. It's colorless. It's very water soluble. It reacts with nitric and sulfuric acids to form particulate matter. So it's not a direct part of particulate matter, but it does react to create particulate matter. So then our toxic air pollutants. It's any pollutant that has been classified as hazardous to the human health or the environment. There's a list of 198 toxic air pollutants found in the Louisiana regulations. Those regulations include 14 pollutants that are not on EPA's list of hazardous air pollutants. We classify the toxic air pollutants into 3 classes. The first class are the known and probable human carcinogens. Class 2 are suspected carcinogens. And then class 3 are just our acute and chronic non-carcinogenic toxins. So they kind of get lower in the level of severity as the classes get higher. So our emissions inventory, it's an annual inventory of point sources. We collect the data directly from facilities, and all emissions from each facility for the calendar year are included. We do a triennial inventory for area, mobile, and biogenic sources, and it's based primarily on emissions estimates and emissions modeling developed by EPA with inputs from DEQ. So which facilities have to report to our point source emissions inventory? So because we have the 2 different types of pollutants, the rules for each type of pollutant reporting are different. So for criteria reporting, it basically boils down to any facility that has the potential to emit more than 100 tons of any criteria pollutant. It also, that expanded area because of non-attainment is any facility that's in a non-attainment area with the potential to emit above a specified threshold. So for example, the Baton Rouge area, any facility that has the potential to emit more than 10 tons of VOC are captured in the requirements for submitting emissions inventory. And you can look at our regulations to see the list of all the thresholds. And then in addition, all major sources of toxic air pollutants are required to submit a point source inventory. And then for our toxic air pollutant reporting, it's basically any major source of toxic air pollutants. And major sources are defined as a facility that emits more than 10 tons of a single toxic air pollutant, or more than 25 tons of any combination of toxic air pollutants. So for our emissions inventory, what data is reported? Any facility meeting the eligibility has to report all of their criteria pollutant emissions. Only facilities that have toxic reporting requirements must also report their TAPs. The emissions are either actual measured emissions using continuous emissions monitoring systems or stack test data. And then if that concrete measured emissions information is not available, the emissions are estimated using approved methodologies such as emission factors, emission models, engineering judgment, and mass balance. And if you're not familiar with an emissions factor, emission factors are published by EPA, and they are basically a certain industries and practices. They take a collection of tests run by individual facilities, and they come up with the average emissions for a certain activity. And so basically it becomes a baseline that if you don't have a formal way to test, say, a boiler, you can use EPA's emission factor for a boiler of that size and estimate your emissions. So there are some additional non-attainment area ozone reporting requirements. If your facility is an ozone non-attainment area and has to submit emissions inventory, we also collect data on ozone season emissions information. We get daily emissions information for CO, NOx, VOC, ethylene, and propylene. We also get their throughput information, which is like how much of a product is consumed, like how much fuel was burned during ozone season. We also get the heat content in million BTU during ozone season. And we also get specific ozone season estimation method information for those pollutants. The reporting deadline for all point source emissions inventories, both criteria and toxic, is April 30th of the following year. So the reporting year for 2020, which would cover the emissions from calendar year January 1st to December 31st for 2020, all of those emissions would have to be reported and due by April 30th of 2021. When you report emissions inventory, you have to submit both the electronic data as well as a signed paper certification statement certifying the data that you've submitted electronically. The certification is an attestation that the data that is submitted in the inventory is accurate. To the best of the knowledge of the person signing it, it has to be signed by a responsible official, and it does hold them liable for criminal and civil prosecution for submitting knowingly false information. And if facilities are found to be submitting information that is like intentionally inaccurate, it can be pursued as a criminal offense. So emissions inventory fees, in addition to requiring that the emissions inventories are reported, fees are also generated based on the emissions reported. An invoice is sent out after the emissions inventories are reported every year, and the amount is based on the type of pollutant and the class of toxic air pollutants. So the air fees are listed in our regulations. They round up to the nearest whole ton and are assessed the appropriate fee amount. And I've included the fees on this slide. And so criteria pollutants, all criteria pollutants are invoiced at $13.91 per ton, up to 4,000 tons per pollutant. For particulate matter, PM 2.5 is considered as a subset of PM 10, so we only invoice based on PM 10. Lead and ammonia are invoiced through the toxic air pollutant fees because they are also toxic air pollutants. So our different classes for the toxic air pollutants, as expected, those more severe class 1 pollutants, the fee is higher than the class 2 and class 3 pollutants. So in addition to how helpful it is and useful having the emissions inventory is, there are federal and state regulations that require us to collect the information included in the emissions inventory. So the Clean Air Act includes a requirement to collect pollutant information for ozone non-attainment areas every 3 years. In addition, the Code of Federal Regulations includes requirements under the Air Emissions Reporting Rule for us to collect an annual point source emissions inventory and the every 3-year effectively every 3 years we get an inventory that has all of the different sources of emissions for the entire state. We submit that data to EPA every year, and then that data is incorporated into the National Emissions Inventory. The state regulations related to emissions inventory are in Chapter 9 of the air regulations. It's LEC 33, 3, 9, 18, and 19. 918 covers the non-attainment area thresholds, and 919 are the general regulations related to emissions inventory. And then in our regulations, Chapter 51, specifically 5107, has all of the information about our toxic emissions inventory. So now we're going to kind of switch gears and talk about ERIC and what ERIC is. ERIC stands for the Emissions Inventory Reporting and Inventory Center. It is our online tool for collecting data related to emissions inventory. It's how we collect both the criteria and toxic pollutants. And it requires a detailed accounting of all emissions down to the individual pieces of equipment. It is not just facility totals. It is very detailed emissions information. And it is required by the regulations, which we just covered. And if you want to go our internal website, our DEQ website that gives information about ERIC and resources related to ERIC, if you go to www.deq.la.gov/ERIC, there's lots of information there. And there's also our contact information if you're looking, if you want to get in touch with us about ERIC. This is, if you go to that website, you will see, this is basically what our homepage looks like, and there's an icon for ERIC, and that's how you would get to the actual ERIC business tool for submitting emissions inventory data. For new ERIC users, when you create an account in the DEQ business ERIC site, you have to request access to specific facility accounts within the ERIC system. What that does is it associates your user account with specific facilities. It's kind of like when you sign up, I don't know, like when you sign up with your bank, you would create an account and then get access to your specific bank accounts. And the access to those accounts can be approved and granted through two different ways. If there's an existing account administrator in ERIC, they can approve additional people to be able to see and edit data in their accounts. And also, if there is no account administrator, DEQ, we will provide a pre-registration code to someone that works at the facility to create an account, and then they become an active administrator. There are 3 different types of users in ERIC. You have readers, which only have access to see data. They can't edit data, and they can't submit an inventory. Managers, it gives people editing privileges for ERIC data. They can both edit and submit emissions inventory. They can edit data, they can upload data, they can create new inventories, edit existing inventories. And most often this is the role that would be assigned to just anyone at the facility that wants to use ERIC, as well as consultants that are used to input the data into ERIC. And then account administrators in ERIC, they have all of the same user roles as a manager, but in addition, they're able to approve and deny access requests from other people to see facility data. When you log into ERIC, this is an example, this is our test site, so none of this data is actually real, but it gives you an idea of what it looks like when you log in and you have access to a facility. It shows you the facility's name and information at the top, and then you see a list of all of the historic inventories submitted. And it goes back as far as the facility has submitted inventories. Even before ERIC was created, the department went through and did a backfill and populated ERIC with all of the emissions inventory data we had in existence. And so some facilities, their emissions inventory data goes back to like 2003 and 2004. But going back as far as emissions inventories have been submitted, you can view, download, you can revise and edit the data and submit a new inventory for previous years. But this is kind of, you get a summary screen of all of your inventories and then can interact with them. The color coding on that screen is related to the status of the inventory. Because you can upload data, if you've got an upload going, that the record for that inventory would be red, showing that it can't be edited because something's being uploaded. Again, also similarly with validating, when you go to submit an inventory, you have to validate your inventory first. And when it's in validation, it goes blue because it can't be edited at that point either. When it is in editing mode and it can be edited, it becomes green. Once an inventory has been submitted, the data gets locked and it becomes this, I guess, tan color. And then once it's been certified, it becomes blue. And so it is a two-step process. First, you submit the data electronically, and then you mail in that signed certification statement. When we record that we've received your certification statement is when it turns blue and shows that that inventory is complete. If you revise an inventory and start a revision, the previous inventory becomes gray and is marked as revised. Facilities have two different options for entering data into ERIC. You can enter the data into on-screen forms using the ERIC application, or you can put your data in a spreadsheet and upload that data into ERIC. Generally, the on-screen entry, there's a lot of screens because there's a lot of very detailed data required. The on-screen entry is really helpful for new users because it gives them a kind of, there's an on-screen definition of each data point, and it runs validations as soon as you typed it in and hit save. Excuse me. So that's really good for new users and small facilities, but the spreadsheet upload really makes including a lot of data more accessible. You can fill out a spreadsheet, you can copy and paste rows, you can review all of your data, and then upload it all at once. So for the data collection, when I talk about it being a lot of detailed information, I am not kidding. We collect information for every part of what goes into the emissions being created. We collect information about the source of the emissions, the process that created the emissions, the release point for the location that those emissions are released into the atmosphere, and any control systems that the emissions pass through to reduce the emissions before they reach the atmosphere. And that information, we'll get into more detail in a minute, but that information, in addition to getting all of that level of detail, we also require facilities to divide up and identify their emissions based on whether they were routine emissions that happen all the time, variance emissions, which happen that are not regular emissions, but were authorized through a variance. There are also some authorized but non-routine emissions like emergency emissions for emergency engines, startup and shutdown emissions, and unauthorized emissions. Those emissions have to be detailed and divided out so that they can be identified as part of their emissions inventory. So you may have one piece of equipment and you have to give the source, the process, the release point, the control system, and then you also have to divide it out into the emissions types. So this is a diagram of the categories, or the relationship between the categories of information in ERIC. And we're going to go through this one by one, but it basically shows the structure, and every one of these boxes is a different spreadsheet in ERIC. So for each inventory, you have facility information, and that gives you your coordinates for where the location, where the facility is, its address, just identifying information about the facility. And then for every facility, there are one or more contacts. Then you've got your source and your process and your release point and your control system. Each of these boxes isn't just one piece of data, it's several pieces of data that are collected for each emissions source. An example of this, and it's called the emissions path, that combination of the source, process, control device, release point, and emissions is called the emissions path. And here's just two examples to kind of, like, I guess, illustrate how that works. And so if you had a source, it could be a boiler, a heater, something that burns fuel, and the burning of the fuel would be that process. So you would have to give us information about the source, like it gives you, it has an identifier, it has a description. You would have information about how many BTUs the boiler is rated at. There's other information collected about the source, and then the same goes for the process. And I've included two on here because for that same boiler, you could have two different processes. So you would have two different emissions paths for the same piece of equipment. So there would be one emissions path that included the process for when that boiler is burning natural gas, and then there would be an alternate, which is the bottom row, for when that boiler burns fuel oil. And in this example, there is no control device, but you could also have a control device, and we would collect information on that control device. And then you have the release point, which is where that boiler is located. If the emissions come from the boiler, but if the emissions go to a flare, the flare would be the release point rather than where the location of the boiler is. And then the final piece are the emissions. And so you would have one record for emissions that bring together the source, process, the control device, the release point, and then that routine and unauthorized are two different emissions paths, one for routine emissions and one for unauthorized emissions. So in this example, you would have one piece of equipment and you could have up to 3 records created emissions-wise for that single piece of equipment, having to break out the emissions into what fuel they were burning and whether the emissions were routine or unauthorized. So that kind of covers the general structure of ERIC. In addition to the ERIC data collection, and we maintain all of that data and it's available through public records request, we've also created some public reports and made them accessible without a public records request. You don't need an ERIC account to access them. And there's 3 general categories for these public reports. We've got radius search reports, emissions totals by parish, and prior year data sets. To get to the public reports, if you go to the ERIC website, so that would be, if you go to the DEQ website and click that icon for ERIC, it will bring you to a screen that looks like this. Without logging in, you will have a link at the bottom for public reports. And then that will bring you to this page that gives you the 3 different types. And so for the radius search, you have the option to get, and there's, at the top of this little screenshot, you can see there's a radio button for actual emissions reports, permitted emission reports, or get both reports. So the radius search, what it does is you enter your coordinates in decimal degrees, longitude and latitude, and a radius in meters for how far you want from that center point for your radius search. And you choose a pollutant and the reporting year, and you will get a list of all release points and their emissions for any facility within that radius. The actual emissions radius search gives you certified emissions directly from ERIC. What's available in the dropdown are the last 5 years plus baseline data. For the permitted emissions radius search, you were going to get permitting data directly from Tempo. It will only include currently operating permits. You won't get any pending permit application or historical permit data. It's just the live, currently effective permits. And then the other option for emissions by parish, these screenshots are not necessarily at the bottom left is what your entry screen looks like. You will choose a reporting year and your pollutant. And then the largest box on this slide is what the results would look like. I did the SO2 for 2020, and you would get a list of the parishes and their total emissions in tons for the reporting year. And then at the bottom of the screen is a little circle in the top right-hand corner. You would have the option to export the data to Excel if you would like it that way. So then prior year data sets, there's a link through ERIC, or you can also just go to www.deq.la.gov/page/ERIC public reports. And what that is a spreadsheet that has all of the emissions by facility, by year, and by pollutant. Currently, it's a single spreadsheet that has all of the emissions from ERIC in it, but we're getting size constraints where pretty soon we're going to have to break that out into multiple spreadsheets. We'll probably do one spreadsheet that has all of the emissions from 1991 to 2010, and then another spreadsheet for 2010 and more recent. Since the 1991 to 2010 data doesn't really change at this point, it will make the file size smaller and basically just make it easier to maintain, because we're hitting up against a wall right now with being able to run the report. But basically, if you go to the website, there's a link. What's in there in green at the bottom is the link to the certified emissions data spreadsheet. Special inventories are something that the agency can request. It is outlined in the regulations as an option. So we collect an annual inventory for the entire state. And if necessary, like if a new national ambient air quality standard is established, we may have to run other or request special inventories where for a specific area and time period, we ask for more detailed or different emissions inventory information. For example, I believe that for the sulfur dioxide NACs update in 2000 I'm not going to even pretend to know which year it was, but in the not too distant past, since I've been working with Eric, we've done a special inventory for the SO2 NACs in the areas where there was concern, where we got hourly emissions process data. So that is something that we can do in addition to the annual emissions inventory. So now we'll talk about related EPA programs, and we're going to cover 4 of them. There's the Toxics Release Inventory, the National Air Toxics Assessment, the Greenhouse Gas Inventory, and EPA's Envirofax Data Warehouse. The Toxics Release Inventory is a publicly available EPA database that has information on toxic chemicals and waste management activities reported annual as part of the toxics release reporting rule. And it is actually not an air rule at all. It was mandated by the Superfund amendments as part of the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. So the inventory and the toxics release inventory is not related in any way directly to the national emissions inventory or our state inventory, but the data from the toxics release inventory, because the facilities that have to submit data for the toxics release inventory, the requirements of which facilities submit are slightly different or can be different than the air inventory. EPA does use the TRI to backfill and augment the point source inventory for the national emissions inventory. If that makes sense. There are differences between the emissions inventory and the TRI. For the emissions inventory, it's air pollutant releases only. It's based on the geographical location as well as the emissions, which trigger who has to report. And once the emissions inventory regulations apply, there's no minimum amount of emissions needed to report. A facility has to report all of the emissions from the entire facility once they trigger emissions inventory regulation reporting. And the pollutants collected are both criteria and toxics. For the TRI, it's emissions into air, water, land, and injection. So it's not just air. And it's also not bound by geographical area. So if a facility is located in multiple locations, or outside of a non-attainment area, the applicability is not based on those things. There is a minimum threshold on how much pollutants you have to emit or release before reporting is required, and only certain industrial facilities have to report. It is generally based on the type of industry rather than how much they pollute. And they only collect toxic pollutant data. And that would be EPA's list of hazardous air pollutants, not Louisiana's toxic air pollutants. The TRI contacts, because the TRI is not something that DEQ is involved in, there are, because it's under the Community Right to Know Act, The TRI is actually overseen in Louisiana by the state police. So you can there's a link here to the Louisiana State Police website where they give information, and the email address if you want to contact state police about the TRI, that is the email address listed on their website. And the EPA contact for Region 6 is Mort Wakeland. And there's his contact too if you have any questions about the TRI. The National Air Toxics Assessment. It's a triannual report generated by EPA. What it is that they take the national emissions inventory and they estimate the ambient concentrations of toxics across the United States. And they estimate the pollutant population exposure for every census tract. They characterize potential public health risks due to the inhalation of the air toxics. So they take the information that we have in the National Emissions Inventory, they model it based on the estimated cancer risk for each pollutant, and then they estimate the population exposure based on the census population estimates for the areas that have those pollutants modeled. It is important to be aware when you look at the National Air Toxics Assessment website to note what the air toxics assessment is not. When they create EPA includes this on their website, and please make sure that you read it and understand that the air toxics assessment is not, it's an assessment and it's an estimation. They make a lot of assumptions in the data that goes into the air toxics assessment, and you'll see that it changes pretty dramatically from release to release. They discover or decide that pollutants have new or things that didn't have a cancer risk before suddenly are added to the list. So for 1 year, an area may look like there's not much, and then 3 years later, even though the emissions have not changed, the assessment will look very different. So it's not actually trying to give precise exposure risk for specific people that live in those areas. It is generally used as a tool to help government and people look at where we should look next to focus on reducing emissions and areas that might be problems that need to be addressed. So it shouldn't be used as just because the National Air Toxics Assessment says the risk is high here doesn't necessarily mean that it is actually high for that area. To access NATA, here's the link. You go to the EPA website. If you just search for NATA, you'll get it. And this is a screenshot from the 2014 National Air Toxics Assessment. Because it's based on the triannual National Emissions Inventory, the next one will be released soon, which will be for the 2017 National Emissions Inventory. It's always going to run several years behind because the National Emissions Inventory is generally released 1 or 2 years behind the reporting requirement date. So let's say for this 2014 National Emissions Inventory was probably not published by the EPA until 2016. And then they had to run all of the modeling and do everything to release the National Air Toxics Assessment. So the 2014 NATA was released in 2018. The 2017 NATA will probably not be released until sometime next year. So there's always a fairly big delay in the release of the National Air Toxics Assessment compared to the year's reporting that it is based on. Then the greenhouse gas inventory. This is another inventory that Louisiana we do not collect data for the greenhouse gas inventory. It's a program run entirely by EPA. There's kind of two components to the greenhouse gas inventory. There's the greenhouse gas reporting rule requirement, which requires large sources of facilities in the United States to report their greenhouse gas emissions. There's an online reporting tool for those greenhouse gas emissions called the EGGRT, and there's a link to it there if you want more information. And the information from that greenhouse gas reporting reporting rule is then included with, it's similar to point and non-point source emissions inventory. Your greenhouse gas reporting rule is like the point source inventory, where they collect the data from large facilities. And then that goes in to create an inventory of US greenhouse gas emissions and sinks. And what that is that is a national emissions inventory for greenhouse gases. It's a comprehensive accounting for all greenhouse gas emissions from man-made sources. And it also includes the removal of greenhouse gas emissions, which are called sinks, through the uptake of carbon. So it includes how much carbon is removed by vegetation and forests to do a comprehensive US greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So I did not include a slide with the contact information from that, but if you go to the EPA greenhouse gas emission site, there will be EPA contacts for the greenhouse gas inventory. And last but not least is the Envirofacts website. EPA has a great website for accessing all data from pretty much all of their programs through Envirofacts. It's a data warehouse that lets you search based on media. It lets you see enforcement information as well as emissions inventory information. It's got your TRI information. Pretty much all of EPA's data that you could be looking for, you can access through Envirofacts, and you get to it through enviro.epa.gov. And I recommend that you check it out. You can look for a specific address and see all of the facilities around it. It's a really great tool. And so I thought I would include it here. And last but not least, this is a list of our emissions inventory staff at DEQ. Jason Myers is my administrator. So if you would like to give him comments or feedback on anything you need or don't get from me, feel free to contact him. And then I am the environmental scientist senior involved with emissions inventory, and the only other person at the agency is Maureen Ducote, who is my sidekick, and we do all emissions inventory things together. So that is our contact information if you want to contact us. And last but not least, Eric, our Little Mermaid Prince, is our mascot. We've used him as, he is the Eric when we get contacted and someone wants to speak to Eric, he is who you're talking to. And so if you have any questions for Eric, please email him at eric@la.gov. Those emails literally go to both me and Maureen, so you should get the fastest response possible that you're going to get if you email Eric. But you are really going to get a response from me or Maureen. And I think I'm ready to open it up for questions if Tamika's ready.
Thank you, Kelly. And thanks for participating, everyone. I hope this information is helpful to you, and you will join us again for an Enviroschool webinar.